Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar in which we're delighted to present Dr. Igor Kreimerman, who is Senior Lecturer at the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. This is a virtual panel discussion jointly sponsored by the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society and the British Friends of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. My name is Sarah Pearce, and as the chair of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society, it's my privilege to introduce this special event. It's also my privilege to introduce Nigel Salomon, who is the chief executive of the British Friends of the Hebrew University and who will give the closing remarks following the lecture. As many of you will know, 2025 marks the 100th year since the official opening of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1925. The roots of the university go back to the late 19th century and the efforts of scholars to imagine and plan for a Hebrew university, a university of the Jewish people. A bold initiative in that century when widespread discrimination impeded access to university life for Jews as students and as teachers. The 1880s saw the beginning of a concerted campaign for an exceptional institute of higher education in Israel. Soon the idea was promoted by major scholars and thinkers of the early 20th century, including Otto Warburg, Sigmund Freud, Martin Buber, and Albert Einstein, until in 1925, a university for the Jewish people in Jerusalem officially opened its doors to students and faculty. And it is now one of the world's top comprehensive universities. Since its early days, the Hebrew University has played a foundational and world-leading role in the study of the archaeology of the region. Through the department, later the Institute of Archaeology, founded in 1934. It represents the oldest archaeology department in Israel and is known as the birthplace of archaeology in that country, the early generations of its teachers as the founding parents of the discipline. These include Yigael Yadin, who from 1955 to 1958, with a final season in 1968, led a Hebrew University team of archaeologists in the pioneering excavation of Tel Hatzor in Galilee. Today, we are also commemorating with Dr. Kreimerman's lecture the 70th anniversary of those first excavations of Tel Hatzor and the work that followed up to the present day with the excavations led in memory of Yadin by Dr. Kreimerman himself. So we are honoring the anniversaries of the foundation of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and of the first excavations of Tel Hatzor. Next year, in 2026, sees another major anniversary, the 100th year of the British Friends of the Hebrew University, a philanthropic society founded to support the Hebrew University from its earliest days. Its goal to nurture intellectual strength through the appointment of outstanding faculty, to provide buildings and facilities for teaching and research, scholarships and fellowships, to promote academic collaboration in all areas of academic study. Members of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society, which I represent, recently celebrated our 60th year since foundation, so we are a relative newcomer. The society was founded in 1961 following Yigael Yadin's spectacular discoveries at Hatzor and an exhibition of finds from those excavations hosted by the British Museum. Our society's purpose was, and still is, to make known what is being done by current archaeologists working in Israel. Yadin himself played a key role in the foundation of our society and gave the first public lecture on our behalf. In an age when virtual lectures were still to be imagined, his appearance drew crowds so large that they could not be accommodated in a lecture hall, spilling out into the streets. The enthusiasm was electric and helped propel the future success of the society. The Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Friends of the Hebrew University have always represented a fundamental relationship for us in the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society. Our principal founder and longtime chair, Dr. Richard Barnett of the British Museum, worked closely with Yadin and his colleagues at the Hebrew University to promote the archaeology of Israel and its public understanding, and to promote archaeological work at the Hebrew University in particular. Among Richard Barnett's many honours in recognition of his outstanding scholarship and service to the academic world was the award by the Hebrew University of a visiting fellowship in 1975. In his tribute to Yigael Yadin, published in 1985, Richard Barnett wrote, "Let us hope that ways and means may be found to keep alive his memory and to finish some or all of his uncompleted tasks and publications." So it is particularly appropriate that today we welcome as our lecturer Dr. Igor Kreimerman, not only as a representative of archaeology at the Hebrew University, but also as a scholar dedicated to completing what Yadin began at Hatzor. Before I introduce Dr. Kreimerman more fully, I need to just go through a few housekeeping points. Dr. Kreimerman has graciously agreed to take questions after the lecture, so please do put your questions into the chat. You can do this while the lecture is ongoing, but everyone will be muted apart from the lecturer during the actual talk. Please do also consider joining the mailing lists of both our organizations so that we can keep you up to date with our events. And I should also say that this lecture will be recorded and made available shortly afterwards on our YouTube channels. So now to introduce Dr. Kreimerman. I'm delighted to welcome you. As I've mentioned already, Dr. Kreimerman is Senior Lecturer at the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University. He earned his PhD from the same institution before he undertook postdoctoral research at the universities of Cambridge and Heidelberg. Dr. Kreimerman specializes in biblical archaeology, focusing on the archaeology of the Bronze and Iron Age Levant, with particular interest in construction and destruction processes, architecture, and the interplay between archaeology and written sources. He has taken part in excavations at several key sites, including Kirbet Kayafa and Lachish, and has directed excavations at Tel Bayit Mirsim. Since 2022, he has led the Seltz Foundation Hatzor excavations in memory of Yigael Yadin. And today he will deliver a lecture for us on debates in the dust, 70 years after the first dig at Hatzor and the shaping of biblical archaeology. Thank you very much.
For this very kind introduction, and thank you very much for the British Friends of the Hebrew University and the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you everybody for joining us. So the Tel Hatzor, sorry, it doesn't move. Second. Just do it again. Yes. Okay, so Tel Hatzor, as you probably know, is located in northern Israel. It is the largest biblical period mound in the land of Israel, namely the largest Bronze and Iron Age mound in the land of Israel. And that's a flagship excavation project of the Hebrew University since 1955, when it was commenced, when the excavations have been commenced by the late Professor Yigael Yadin. And since 1990, it is almost continuously excavated, except 2 years of COVID and the recent year due to the eruption of the war in the region, mostly by Professor Amnon Ben-Tor, until 2023, when he sadly passed away. And since then, I replaced him as a director of the excavations. Now, the beginning of the Hatzor excavations is tightly connected to England and the British Friends of Hebrew University, and later, of course, to the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society, because the Yadin, when he started the project and he collected the funding and the means for the project when he was in a research stay during his PhD in London. And instrumental in this aspect were, of course, the Rothschilds, Dorothy de Rothschild and James de Rothschild, who funded the excavations, who he met during his stay, and also, of course, Leon Shalit, who was among the founders later of the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society, and who was back then an executive in Marks and Spencer, and he helped immensely in facilitating contacts for Yadin with potential donors and funders, and also practically in purchasing all the equipment that was necessary for the excavations. Now, the Tel Hatzor excavations were really a turning point in the archaeology of the land of Israel, and especially of Israeli archaeology, because up until then, there were quite a few large-scale excavations by British, French, German, and of course American scholars in the Near East, and even in Israel itself. You can only mention the Megiddo excavations, such a large excavations project, or Petrie's excavations even earlier in Tel el-Jul and Tel Hesi. There were large-scale excavations. But although the Israel Exploration Society was funded in 1913, most of the excavations led by Jewish archaeologists and later by Israeli archaeologists were of rather small scale, of modest sites, and of normally sites with clear Jewish orientation. And Yadin envisioned something much larger, much greater. He wanted to execute an excavation which is comparable to the large excavations of the great powers. And that's why he needed so much funding, and that's why he needed to put all of this great effort. That's why he put all this great effort in the logistics of those excavations. And indeed, the Hatzor excavations were the largest excavations conducted by an Israeli archaeologist by then. In some periods, there were over 200 workers at the site. He had 45 staff members, including area supervisors, assistant area supervisors, surveyors, pottery restorers, specialists, and so on. And the greatest thing that Yadin did back then, because he himself originally he didn't have much field experience, is that he took the best field archaeologists available back then, including Yochanan Aharoni, Ruth Amiran, and he also trained an entire generation of students of the Hebrew University, who later had become prominent archaeologists, such as, of course, the late Professor Amnon Bentor, who later directed the excavations, and Ephraim Stern, Ami Mazar, and many others who really became prominent figures in the archaeology of the land of Israel. And most importantly, and beyond all of that, Yadin had put great efforts in publishing the reports of Hatzor. And although he didn't publish all the reports when he was alive, and some of them were published only post-mortem, he did publish two very substantial volumes of the results that really helped to shape to set a new standard in the publication and in the study of finds. And the Hatzor excavations had also a very important role in the nation building of Israel back then, and they actually turned archaeology to, so to speak, the national hobby. All the important people, including Ben Gurion himself, and you could see here Moshe Dayan, and all sorts of ministers and officials came to visit Hatzor and to see the ancient Israelites, and of course the Canaanites, and a few conventions and tours that were conducted at Hatzor. Those tours attracted hundreds of people, and the excavations have really helped to disseminate archaeology among the residents of Israel. So really, Hatzor played a very prominent role in this sense. And here you could see, for instance, a picture of Yigael Yadin on the right with William Foxwell Albright, the famous American archaeologist, Immanuel Dunayevsky, Trude Dotan, Ruth Amiran, and Yohanan Aaroni among the staff of Hatzor. And that's basically the senior staff of the excavations, especially during the first seasons. Now, Yadin, in 1984, the year of his death, he actually planned another season of excavations at Hatzor. He wanted to conduct another excavation in 1985, and sadly he passed away. But in his will, he basically gave the site to one of his prominent students, and by then already a prominent professor, Professor Amnon Bentor. And Amnon Bentor, after publishing already an additional volume of Yadin's excavations of the site, volume 3 and 4 of Hatzor excavations, he renewed the excavations of Hatzor in 1990, and the excavations ran almost continuously until this very day, and he directed the excavations until his death in 2023. Now, that project was already very different, whereas Yadin's project was concentrated around labor workers, specifically Israelis. Amnon Bentor's project was much more international, with volunteers from the entire world. And here you could see in one of the pictures, Amnon Bentor guiding the King and Queen of Spain, who actually sponsored part of the project back then. And numerous volunteers from the entire world came to excavate Hatzor. Now, one of the reasons that Yadin came to Hatzor is to investigate the question of Joshua's conquest of Hatzor. And just to give you a brief background, back then Yadin at least felt that there was an attack on the Hebrew Bible as an historical source, because excavations at Ai and in Jericho, other sites that were allegedly conquered by Joshua, showed quite problematic results, with no evidence for Joshua's destruction, and in some cases there was actually no city that could have been destroyed by Joshua back then. And Yadin already knew that the site is a large site, and it is composed of an upper city that later that was occupied from the early Bronze Age until the end of the Iron Age, and also a lower city, which was huge, about 80 hectares in size, that was occupied only during the Bronze Age. He knew it from the excavations of John Garstang, who conducted one season at Hatzor in the 1920s, but regrettably never published it. So Yadin decided to go to this site and to examine the extent of the Canaanite, the Bronze Age city, and to see if indeed Joshua destroyed it. That was actually one of the main goals of the excavations back then. And I think that the greatest achievement of Yadin back then is that he put this huge Canaanite city, which has basically almost no parallel in Israel, on the map. And indeed, whether we accept Joshua's narrative or not, it was definitely clear that Hatzor was the head of all those kingdoms, just as the book of Joshua claims. It's 80 hectares in size. Here you could see the huge ramparts of the city, built from millions of tons of earth, spilled by the residents of Hatzor when it was first constructed during the Middle Bronze Age. You could see here the massive fortifications that Yadin uncovered, including some ramparts and city gates in the lower city, and also massive public structures, including the well-known Orphistat temple that you could see is very nicely lined with Orphistat. Yadin was able to demonstrate that the temples follow the so-called Syrian style of monumental temples, and indeed the connections between Tel Hatzor and the north, Syria, and of course even further Mesopotamia. And of course, he uncovered some of the most monumental features that have been found in Chatzor, including famous lion orthostats that were found, one of which was found buried in a pit just by the entrance of the temple. And he shed light on the entire material culture of that huge, enormous city. Of course, another great discovery of Yadin were the numerous cuneiform tablets that were found. Actually, they're not so numerous yet, but the nature of the tablets, namely the fact that we have school exercises, and we have law codices, and we have also judicial documents, suggest that there must have been somewhere, at least one archive, where those documents were kept, and this notion was reinforced also by the excavations of Professor Bentor, and we're still in the search of this archive, and we'll get to the potential location of that archive, of course, during this talk. And also, it was clear back then, also from extra biblical sources, that Chatzor was really a prominent city, sometimes even more prominent than many other Canaanite cities in the region. And here I'm referring to what the late Professor Bentor was calling the flattery index. When we examine the Amarna letters dated to the late Bronze Age, the reign of Amenhotep III and IV, we see how various kings address the pharaoh. So, for instance, the king of Chatzor addresses the pharaoh as "Speak to the king, my lord." But the king of Lachish, another prominent Canaanite city, refers to the pharaoh as "Speak to the king, my lord, my God, my son, the sun from the sky." And when the king of Chatzor identifies himself, he identifies himself as the king of the city of Chatzor, whereas the king of Tyre, for instance, or many other kings would identify themselves as Abimilku, your servant. I fall at the feet of the king, my lord, 7 times and 7 times. I'm the dirt and the feet and the sandals of the king, my lord. You are the eternal son. So basically what we do see here is that the position of the king of Chatzor is actually higher than of other Canaanite kings from the region. And the excavations of Professor Amnon Bentor, which concentrated primarily on the upper tell until recent years. In recent years, we also went back to excavate the lower city, showed some more evidence of this magnificent city and its power. One of the prize finds of the excavations of Professor Bentor was the ceremonial precinct right in area A, right in the uppermost part in the upper mound. It is a massive structure. Here you could see the very massive walls of that building. And you see that in the quarters of the building, there is basically what seems to be a massive altar where sacrifices could take place. And the entrance to the edifice itself is through stairs, and the structure itself is lined from the outside and from the inside with orthostats, basalt orthostats, which required, of course, a great deal of work. And cedar wooden beams were integrated in the construction of that massive edifice. And here you could see a modern reconstruction of how those walls probably looked. And basically, when we look at this structure, we have a courtyard with an altar and some porticos on the side where people could see the rituals taking place. And then there was an entrance to the structure itself. The function of a structure was definitely debated. Professor Bentor suggested that it was a palace. In this sense, he followed Yadin, because actually Yadin thought that the archive would be found exactly in this structure. That was the area that Yadin planned to excavate in 1985, but he never was able to do so. So Bentor identified the structure as a palace, although the archives have not been found there. But there were different suggestions arguing that the symmetry of the structure, and the altar in the courtyard would rather make it a temple and not a palace. And indeed, a heated debate developed in this sense. Professor Bentor argued for a palace. His colleague for many years, the late Dr. Sharon Zuckerman, argued that it was a temple, and a scholarly debate still continues about the exact nature of the structure. But the finds from within were really extraordinary. Here you could see this basalt statue with a huge bowl, which most probably contained water for purification at the entrance to the structure, and these two magnificent Bronze Age bronze statues. The right one is from the Amarna period, and it probably represents the Canaanite storm god Baal. And the left one is from the Middle Bronze Age, and it probably represents a deceased king, one of the kings of Hatzor, and they were actually found buried in a cache within the building. And the additional bronze statues, and also a jewelry box in which you could see the integration of Egyptian motifs together with Canaanite motifs, once again stressing the tight connections between Hatzor and Egypt during the period. So, and in recent years, our excavations actually concentrate in Area M, an area which is at the transition from the lower city to the upper city. It's a liminal space in which people who came from the lower cities, such as commoners, had to pass in order to get to the upper city, which was the place of the elite and the residence of the king. And this area is composed of several components. First of all, whoever enters between two upright standing basalt orthostats and arrives to a square podium, 150 meters by 150 meters in size. You could see this podium right over here when it was excavated in the 1990s. And at the top of this podium, there were 4 depressions, which probably facilitated placement of a chair on which either a statue could stand or an official could sit. And what was found just by that podium is the semicircular installation, and around it there were numerous asymmetrical bowls, known also as scoops, that were quite a good suitable vessel for libation, the libation of liquids. And here you could see an artist's reconstruction of a podium centered in a niche, so that basically everyone who was entering the city had to acknowledge whoever was sitting there and possibly perform a ritual before they could move forward to the next components of that compound. So whoever entered to the compound had to perform a ritual in front of a podium, and then they had to turn to a pebbled courtyard from which there was entrance to several other wings of what we understand currently as the wings of the administrative palace of late Bronze Age Hatzor. And I'll say a few words about it in a minute. All of that area was found covered by thick destruction debris of burnt bricks and charred wooden beams, with numerous crushed pottery vessels on the floors. And here you could see those huge pithoi, that many of which were found full with grain, and the destruction was dated to the mid to late 13th century BC. Here you could see the grain being extracted from those huge pithoi. And the most peculiar feature that was uncovered in recent years are this flight of stairs, of 9 stairs, on the top of which there were 2 pillar bases made of basalt. And that's how they were found. That's not a restoration. That's the state of preservation of these stairs. And you could see how nicely those stairs are fitted to the pillar bases. The section of the stairs is trapezoidal to accommodate the pillars. And here you could see that actually the upper part of the stair is shaped as if it was the bottom part of of a pillar. It's not a break. These are two different components created intentionally to fit together. And here you could see actually a wooden pillar made of cedar that probably stood on this pillar base, that just charred and fell off during the destruction of the city. And this white layer is a layer of crushed chalk that was probably the foundation of a wooden floor, because just on top of that, we found a layer of charred wood, which we still have to identify. And that suggests that basically beyond the stairs, where this white layer is, we're already inside the palace of the king of Hatzor, and I'll explain you why we think it's a palace immediately. So basically, we have the entrance compound with a podium, then we have this white pebble paved courtyard that served as a junction to different wings, and from here we have a flight of stairs that probably facilitates entrance to a massive structure. Now, we of course don't know for sure that we are now excavating the palace of Hatzor, but we can compare that palace to, or we can compare whatever we excavated to another structure from the city of Alalakh, today in southeastern Turkey. And when we look at the components and the spatial organization of those architectural components, we can find many lines of similarity. So first of all, we have an entrance compound and a gate in the case of Alalakh, which leads eventually to a large courtyard around which we have some auxiliary structures. And then you could see that in both cases, we have a flight of stairs, which leads already to the interior of the structure. That's where our white floor was. And in the case of Alalakh, that's exactly the entrance to the palace. And the throne room is right over here in room number 4. So we really anticipate in the forthcoming years to excavate really the interior of the palace, and hopefully to find this the anticipated archive, at least of the late Bronze Age, of Hatzor. But what the excavations, both of Yadin of Bentor also highlighted, was that Hatzor in its last years experienced a grave crisis. Here you could see the temple, the Orphistat temple that I showed you previously in the 14th century when it was in its apex, and in the 13th century. And during the 13th century, probably towards the mid-13th century, we see that some silos were constructed in the structure, and the niche at the rear of the temple, which was the location of the main statue of the temple, was blocked, as well as other entrances. And most importantly, in this pit right over here, that's the case where the lion Orphistat was found. Lion originally probably adorned the entrance to the temple. So we do see some sort of break in the last years of the structure, where in which some domestic activities were taking place along cultic activities, when the line of sight from the entrance to the porch and to the outside was blocked. And it seems that there was some sort of ideological break towards the end of the late Bronze Age. We already saw this podium structure, but note this wall right over here. This wall was built in the latest phase of the late Bronze Age, towards the mid-13th century BC. And that wall basically blocked the podium and took it out of use. So if in the 14th century or the early 13th century BC, everyone who'd be entering the city would have to perform this ritual that we talked about, probably a sort of libation. In the mid-13th century BC, it was already unnecessary. Whoever would be entering the city would not see the podium, would not have to pay respect to whoever was sitting there, and could just proceed to the rest of the city. And the destruction of Hatzor was immense and was seen in any public building excavated either by Yadin or by Bentor. And in this sense, of course, in the sense of destruction, it goes hand in hand with the description in the book of Joshua. And that was the reason that originally Yadin attributed this destruction to Joshua. He was able roughly to date the destruction to the 13th century BC. And according to the prevalent biblical chronology back then, that was the anticipated time of Joshua. where Joshua should have conquered the land, and he attributed the destruction to Joshua. And here you could see more fabulous pictures of this magnificent destruction layer. Professor Bentor noted another issue. In the destruction layer of Chatzor, numerous fragments of statues have been found. And here you could see some fragments of Egyptian statues. Here on the left, you could see the front paws of the Sphinx of Menkaure. Menkaure was one of the pharaohs of the Egyptian Old Kingdom and constructor of one of the great pyramids. And on your right, you could see a fragment of statue of Nebi Pu, one of the prominent priests of the during the Middle Kingdom. And you could see here more and more fragments of shattered statues. And actually, Chatzor by now is the site with the second largest amount of Egyptian statues in the Levant, after Byblos. But not only Egyptian statues were shattered, but also Canaanite statues that were shattered. And that brought Professor Bentor to argue that whoever destroyed Chatzor was not necessarily, was someone who did not pay respect either to the Canaanite ideology and religion, nor to the Egyptian ideology and religion, as both types of statues have been destroyed. And in many cases, we can actually see that the head and the hands, the most religiously charged parts of the body in this sense, were the foci of the most violent destruction. So although Professor Bentor was aware of all the great debates about the historicity of the Book of Joshua and the problems with the dating of the Book of Joshua, it was still, he still argued that maybe even if it was not Joshua himself who destroyed Chatzor, it could have been these could have been perhaps the early proto-Israelites, so to speak, who were responsible to that, because they didn't identify themselves as Canaanites or Egyptians. Later on, Zuckerman, who worked with Professor Bentor, actually argued that these were the Canaanites themselves who destroyed Chatzor, and that and that the evidence for the crisis that we see before the destruction is an ideological crisis of the residents themselves of Chatzor, who eventually disregarded the prevailing ideology and decided to overturn the elites and to destroy all the public structures, and eventually had to leave Chatzor. This aspect is, of course, still debated, but in my humble view, I think that in this sense, Professor Bentor is closer is more likely to be correct, especially because of the focus on the destruction of the statues, and also because the Chatzor after this destruction was completely abandoned. And while the residents of Chatzor could, of course, rebel against the elites and even destroy the palaces and the temples and maybe form new elites, the abandonment of the settlement and the abandonment of their own homes, at least currently, does not make sense. But a key point that should be investigated later is not only why Chatzor was destroyed and why was it abandoned in the first place, but also why it had never returned to its glory. Chatzor of the late Bronze Age was a site of 80 hectares, but then later Chatzor of the Iron Age was not larger than 8 hectares. So probably there was something in the area that changed considerably and did not facilitate the erection of such large city in the future. But one of the greatest discoveries that was found by the excavations at Chatzor, and here you could see a plan of Area A, and in gray you see the ceremonial pressing that was either a palace or temple that was excavated during the 1990s. What you see is that all the other colors represent the Iron Age remains. And interestingly enough, those gray, that structure in gray was never really, nothing was really built on top of the core of that structure, suggesting that in this Israelite city at Hatzor, during the Iron Age, there was a huge mound of ruins, but nobody built on top of it. And it was the center of a settlement. It was the most highly prized place in terms of real estate. So the most suggestion here is that it probably was a taboo over the construction at that spot. So whether these were the Israelites who destroyed Hatzor or not, what is interesting is that we perhaps have here the missing link between the destruction of a late Bronze Age city and the formation of the story that we eventually have in the Hebrew Bible, because that mound of ruins that was found within the city was probably the focus of stories that the residents of Hatzor developed there over the years. And eventually, some sort of version of those stories perhaps could have found its way either to the book of Joshua or the book of Judges. The other aspect that was heatedly debated by Yadin is the date of the first Israelite city. And indeed, after the ruins, after the destruction of late Bronze Age Hatzor, there was a phase of a meager settlement, a rural settlement during the 11th century BCE. And in the 10th century, according to Yadin, or in the 9th century, according to his proponents, a fortified city was constructed at the site. And it is best seen by the six-chambered gate and a casement wall constructed of those elongated rooms. Now, Yadin, and it was a very well-planned city. You could see here the six-chamber gate, the casement wall, and then there is a street separating the casement wall with some constructions. And that's what we see in area A at the center of the upper city and area M just at the northern edge of the upper city. The plan is quite consistent. Now, Yadin suggested that six-chambered gates that were also uncovered at the cities of Gezer and Megiddo, as well as casement walls that he thought that were found in both sides, are basically the constructions of King Solomon. And he related this, he dated them to King Solomon according to 1 Kings 9, verse 15, that talks about the construction works of King Solomon, who constructed Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And of course, in classical, we can say circular reasoning, he dated the structures to the time of King Solomon according to the text, and then he also said that the text is, of course, historically correct according to archaeology. And that was actually the point that much later in 1996, Israel Finkelstein from Tel Aviv University used to form his lower chronology. He said that this anchor that he didn't use is actually circular reasoning, and therefore should not be accepted. And actually, even before the time of Finkelstein, there were heated debates about the dating of those gates. Some argued that the three gates of Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer were constructed in the 10th century by King Solomon, while others argued that each gate could have been constructed in a different time and they do not necessarily have to be related. Now, this topic is still heatedly debated until this very day. And what I can suggest to you is some new data that we finally have. In recent years, we sent some samples for radiocarbon dating at the University of Oxford. And what we found out is that the city of Stratton 10, the earliest Iron Age fortified city, was probably constructed sometime in the 10th century, not too late in the 10th century. So it could definitely be the mid-10th century or something around that. So although we cannot prove definitely that it was constructed by King Solomon, it could have been also someone slightly later, we definitely have a date which is fitting the 10th century BC and not the 9th century BC, such as, for instance, Israel Finkelstein argued when he said that this city was constructed only by the Omerides, by Ahab, probably during the early 9th century BCE. What is also interesting that just a few weeks ago, similar dates were published from the site of Gezer. And the excavators there also argue, based on radiocarbon dates, that their six-chamber gate was constructed in the 10th century BC. The case of Megiddo is more complex, and there it seems that the gate was constructed probably in the 9th century BC. But that's already beyond the scope of our talk today. But what was the most surprising area, what surprising discovery in our previous excavation season in 2023 is that we similarly found a new phase in the Iron Age that was previously went unnoticed. So here you could see an aerial photograph, and that the so-called Solomonic casemate wall. I'm using here Yedin's terminology for the sake of clarity. But what we found is this very massive wall, this very massive curving wall that initially we thought it could have been a terrace wall or maybe a drainage channel, but we happened to lift a few stones and there was no channel inside. And also what you could basically see here is that this wall does not really end nicely. There is a gap between this wall and the casemate wall. So in archaeological jargon, what we would say here is that the casement wall basically cuts this curved wall, and therefore the casement wall must be later than our curved wall. And this is a fairly massive construction. So it seemed quite puzzling. What could it be? And a pottery layer that we excavated just by that wall, and that we really wanted to clarify the relations between this pottery layer and the wall in 2024, but we could not excavate in 2024, was dated to the Iron Age to A, so roughly the 10th century BCE to say that. Now, outside, north of the fortifications, we also found a peculiar drainage channel. Here you could see it right over here. It's a drainage channel, and it sits directly on top of the late Bronze Age destruction layer, suggesting that it is later than the late Bronze Age, but it's too low to be used by the fortifications. And we don't see any sign of the drainage channel on this side in the levels relating to the known strata of Chatzor. So it's also a strata that is also a feature that we cannot associate with known structures. So what we decided to do is to go back to our archive. Basically, Chatzor was excavated for 30 years by Professor Bentor, and there are quite detailed archives of all excavation seasons. And what we found in that archive are some additional features that could not really fit in the known stratigraphic scheme. Here you could see this is the location of a previously excavated mud brick wall. You could see it's a very interesting wall because it has no stone foundations. It is built in mud bricks, and there are some lines of stones stuck in that wall. You could see them right over here, probably to tie up somehow the mud bricks and make the wall stronger. And this wall was basically excavated for almost 30 meters. And the function of this wall was never realized, and also the dating was really debated. It was argued that perhaps it was a foundation wall for something later, but nobody builds foundations from mud bricks. So after reviewing the material, we also found out that actually it could not have been a foundation wall, because here in 1996, in excavation 1996, you could see the wall itself, and just by that wall, there was a glacis that abutted the wall. So it was a real fortification wall, but was previously went somehow unnoticed. And in addition to that, we found another interesting structure. You could see it's once again in area M. It is beyond the lines of the fortifications of the Iron Age, of the fortifications of Stratum 10, the first fortified city. And it was composed of several walls with several fallen standing stones. I don't think it's really standing stones in the sense of cultic standing stones, but most likely some sort of pillars that stood on those bases. So it's basically a pillared structure. that was built here as well. It is dated according to the pottery to the RH2A, but it is outside the line of the fortifications of the Solomonic city, so to speak. And once again, it is built on top of the ruins of the late Bronze Age. And here's a reconstruction of that structure. So basically, when we plot all those features on a plan, we realize that we now have a mud brick wall, which was a fortification wall. We have this complex of standing stones. We have this mysterious curved wall, and we have a drainage channel. So basically, we already have several features dating to a new phase. And when we plot it on the plan, we see that basically it is all the location of those features show absolutely no continuity with what with the later architecture of the so-called Solomonic city. So
my apologies, Igor. I just have to as chair say we have 5 more minutes for the lecture.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. So basically, when we look at those remains, we do see that we have a new phase dated probably to either to the early 10th century or to the late 11th century BC, and what previously unrecognized. In really the next years, we're going to investigate these quite interesting features and try to fit it into the stratigraphic scheme and also integrate it within the history of Hatzor. So I'll just finish with what's going next. Where to Hatzor excavations and where does the biblical archaeology goes today? So all those two questions that I talked with you about are heatedly debated, and you know the famous debate between Tel Aviv University and Hebrew University and so on. And of course, one of the greatest revolutions that are going on in recent years is the revolution of the archaeological sciences. And we're now establishing a massive lab, and we just purchased a scanning electron microscope to facilitate our studies. And we're now approaching the same questions, but also with new methods. For instance, we are now sampling the destruction layers, both to understand the reasons for the destruction of Hatzor and the progress of destruction. And also over here, you could see some interesting layer that we find quite mysterious, because it is found on top of the floors of the palace that we are now excavating. But the mud bricks fell not on top of the floor, but on top of this layer. So we're now trying to understand what was this specific layer that was found here. Could it be that perhaps there is another phase that went unnoticed within the palace of late Bronze Age Hatzor? Or could it be that we have some windblown sediment and the structure stood just uninhabited a few years before it was set to the torch, like we know, for instance, from the palace of Mari on the Euphrates several hundred of years earlier? But also what we realize that there is no alternative, especially to a large site like Hatzor, than to excavate with a large team and to achieve large horizontal exposure, broader horizontal exposure, because only through this exposure we were able to come up with new finds. Only through excavating more of Hatzor and excavating complete structures, we were able to identify this new phase in the history of Hatzor, and also to excavate the ceremonial precinct and other structures. We know that the common trend in archaeology is to excavate with smaller expeditions, with smaller teams, and concentrate on scientific methods. We accept that scientific methods are important, but at the same time, the expedition stresses that without achieving larger horizontal exposure, without working with a large team of professionals and large team of students, we will not be able to address the heated questions, to find really substantial data that will change our understanding. And Hatzor, in this sense, is a huge site. Look at it. It's 80 hectares in size. What was excavated so far is just a drop that in this huge city of Hatzor. And now, in recent years, we also expanded our excavations to the lower city, to the very north area of the lower city. And we plan to excavate additional areas to understand aspects such as urban planning and also to address social organization and social structure within the city. And we also understand that the key in our work, and I think also the key in biblical archaeology, is not only to deconstruct other suggestions, but to form testable hypotheses that basically drive research. Even if Yadin was wrong about some of his interpretations, the fact that he was able to form clear theories that could be tested at Hatzor and in other sites, that would actually drove biblical archaeology and facilitated debate and discussion rather than just add data with no meaning. And we also know that understand that the Hebrew Bible is a very complex book, and that we have constantly to review the relationship between textual sources and archaeological evidence. And the textual sources, although they cannot taken at face value, they also have to be integrated in the research. And just as Yadin and Bentor did in their excavations, the focus of our excavations will be, of course, the Canaanite city, which is the most striking feature of Hatzor and which is really unparalleled in the land of Israel. And actually, considering the political situation in the Near East today, in the Middle East today, that's actually the only mega city of the Canaanite mega city that can still be excavated. So I invite you all to join us in our upcoming season of excavations, and I would like to thank you very much for listening and for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor, for a wonderful lecture. We have a little time now for questions. So let's go to them. Based on other palaces, is there an expectation as to where in the palace layout the archive would be found? Have magnetic or other surveys been done to detect the outline of walls in the unexcavated palace area?
Okay, so thank you. It's an excellent question. Well, first of all, the location of the archives changes in different palaces, but so we can't know for sure where the archive is. The challenge with magnetic studies or ground penetrating radar is that the palace is not found just below surface. The palace, the late Bronze Age palace, is attributed to our stratum 13. So we have 12 strata above that. So if we conduct magnetic studies or GPR, we can detect the outline of Iron Age structures, but detecting the outline of the palace is quite difficult in this sense. We do plan to conduct those studies in the lower city, where late Bronze Age remains are found just below surface.
Thank you. We have another question, well, several questions. To what extent was the city destroyed under Seti I? What is the evidence that the late Bronze Age destruction 100 years after Seti might have been caused by the Sea Peoples?
Okay, so the destruction of Seti I is one of Yadin's theories back then as to the destruction of stratum 14, which is roughly dated to the 14th to the early 13th century BC. Now, that destruction was found only in localized spots. It was found only in the area of one of the gates, and perhaps in a few isolated loci. So it's not a site-wide destruction, it's an isolated destruction in the area of the fortifications. And one possibility is that after those fortifications were destroyed, then Hatzor had become unfortified. And therefore, later in the 13th century, it was easier to conquer it. Now, in respect to the Sea Peoples, well, first of all, we should know that Hatzor is not by the coast by any means, it's quite inland. So it's difficult to attribute it to them. And furthermore, Hatzor was probably destroyed in the mid to late 13th century BC, while we do see other destructions such as the destruction of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, and also on the Israeli coast in sites like Ashdod, Ashkelon, and so on. Those destructions are dated to the mid-12th century, so a few decades after Chatzor. So we have actually absolutely no reason to attribute the destruction of Chatzor specifically to the sea people. So that's an option that we can take off the table. We have other options, but not this one.
Thank you. And then one more question I think we have time for. The destruction at the end of the Bronze Age, could it have signified the deactivation of the site or a termination ritual?
Yes, so the late Sharon Zuckerman talked about termination rituals that were conducted at the site, such as the burial of the late of the line Orphistat in the Orphistat temple. So it could be that some statues were buried and some temples or cultic areas were decommissioned before the destruction. Having said that, I don't think that we can that decommissioning and an ideological crisis could be the only reason for the destruction of Chatzor, because even if some structures are decommissioned, there is no reason for the people of Chatzor to leave their own houses. They have their houses, they have probably access to the fields. If they now leave Chatzor, if they go somewhere else, they will get there with nothing. From strictly economic point of view of the individual, there is no reason for doing that. And therefore, it is clear that Chatzor experienced a crisis, and that's probably what facilitated some external agents to conquer Chatzor. If Chatzor was at its prime, a city of at least 15,000 people, which could gather an army of thousands, no one except, let's say, the Egyptian or the Hittite empires could have been able to conquer it. But exactly when Chatzor was in crisis, that gave way to other agents to attack it and probably conquer it.
Thank you. And we have time for one more point. It's a question really. A concern expressed that a lot of antiquities, the questioner says, from Hatzor that are in museums have been collected illegally or have been plundered. Is that something you can comment on?
Well, I don't have many examples for that. Most of the artifacts found in museums, which and we know that their provenances at Chatzor were found either by Yadin or Bentor, and they came to the museums through the Israel Antiquities Authority, and they are on loans there. There were several cases where stolen objects were found. For instance, we have an example of a cuneiform tablet that was someone found its way to New York, and then Yadin heard about it, and it was returned to Israel. But that's practically one of the only cases I have. We don't have many looted objects for Chatzor that I know of, but if there is any information about that, I'll be glad to hear.
Thank you, Igor. I think that must conclude the questions for now. So very many thanks for me, and it's now my pleasure to pass on to Nigel Salomon, the Chief Executive of the British Friends of the Hebrew University, to conclude proceedings. Nigel.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Igor, that was a terrific presentation, knowledgeable, masterful, fascinating, and really comprehensive. So I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody when we express a big thank you to you for your time and your preparation time as well. Thank you very, very, very much indeed.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Some other thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your kind opening words. We very much value the partnership with the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society, and I'm sure we'll soon be talking about our next event. And thank you to Claire, and of course to my colleague Moria in the background, who nobody sees, but has done all the work with logistics and technology to make sure that today flowed so smoothly. I want to reflect very briefly on the times we're in, because they're difficult and not easy times at all. They're times of trauma and suffering for all too many people. And I'm struck, Igor, by an interesting parallel that your work is, like so many, can I say, scientists, your work is the pursuit of truth. and you're still working on it and will be working on it in thousands of years from now. But who would have thought, the founding fathers of the Hebrew University, that your skills in the Institute of Archaeology and in the Israel Antiquities Authority would be turned to the grim but vital work of forensics post-October 7th, and indeed in the recent weeks when coffins have come and will continue to come back from the Gaza envelope. And it's just something that struck me as the founding fathers of the university would never have considered. And yet your work is so vital. Thank you. And yet, with the 100th anniversary approaching, in fact, the exact date for the Hebrew University is the 1st of April. I'm also reminded of the words of the president of the Hebrew University, Professor Asher Cohen, who, when I saw him on campus a few weeks ago, said, "We absolutely must be positive." Einstein envisaged a university that would be involved in the pursuit of knowledge and science in an atmosphere free of prejudice, a pluralist environment where knowledge is shared for people across the world. And that is the mantra that the university is committed to today and will continue to be committed to as we move towards the June 100th International Gathering in Jerusalem. So once again, I want to thank everybody for attending today. Please do look at the chat box. You'll find links to opt into digital communications from both organizations. If I may, just one final comment about a very important event coming up in May, I think the 20th. It's on our website. We have, in partnership with JW3, a presentation called Children in the Aftermath of October the 7th. And we're very fortunate to have in the UK at the time Professor Asher Ben Aryeh, who is the Dean of the Hebrew University School of Social Work and Social Welfare. And Asher has been deeply involved in protocols that the security services in Israel have employed when receiving back hostages and dealing with traumatized families. So his focus on children will be particularly and sadly interesting when he comes to JW3 in May. I'll conclude by once again thanking everybody, thanking you, Igor. We're very grateful, and a sincere wish for much better times ahead. Thank you.